Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hey guys, glad to have you listening into another episode here this week. As always, if you like what you hear today, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Nick, we're recording this a little bit earlier this week since I will be traveling this upcoming weekend, but how has your week been so far?
So just getting started, but it's been good. It's a good week. We're ramping up activities with the kids, different things, and school getting started back, and some different sports and stuff. So it's all good stuff. I wouldn't have it any other way. Just adding it to everything else that's going on. Just keep a list and a schedule going. But maybe a little more sleep could be thrown in there every once in a while. But other than that, it's all good stuff. And I'm looking forward to diving into Hebrews with you. And I hope this is helpful for our listeners. I'm really looking forward to this. I really enjoy this letter. I think there's a lot of really just practical reflections, and hopefully we'll be able to pull those out to the benefit of ourselves and to those listening. So, Cody, I think you're going to get us started today just by reading chapter 1. So,
yep, this is Hebrews chapter 1. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? Or again, "I will be his father, and he will be my son"? Again, when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, "And let all God's angels worship him." And about the angels, he says, "He makes his angels winds, and his servants a fiery flame." But to the Son, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of justice. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. This is why God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy beyond your companions. And in the beginning, Lord, you established the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like clothing. You will roll them up like a cloak, and they will be changed like clothing. But you are the same, and your years will never end. Now to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool'? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve those who are going to inherit salvation?" So like we said last week, we are super excited to be able to go through this book with you all. Each week we're going to at least attempt to read through the section, or at least through the chapter. Most of the chapters are fairly short. If we have to make an adjustment, I'll obviously say something about that. But as we're going through this book, we're going to try to put ourselves into the shoes of the first readers, the first hearers of the message, those first Jewish Christians. So you will likely hear us make references to Jewish culture and first century Christian life, but it'll all be good. We're super excited to be able to go through the book with you. To get us started as far as the study goes, Nick, can you give us a breakdown of what I just read for us?
yeah, I think it's so Hebrews in general, we talked about this last week. We like to think about the idea of Christ's superiority, or what is the point the Hebrew writer is trying to get this Jewish audience to hear and understand. And it's the way he opens up. God sent his Son now. This is significant and powerful. So just a brief, loose outline of this chapter in particular as it pertains to that. I always kind of think about it this way. You have verses 1-3. Here is Christ as a greater messenger, greater than the prophets. And then kind of starting in verse 4 or so, verses 4-13, really further, but for our purposes, Christ is a greater messenger than the angels. And then really verse 14, it sandwiches or kind of ends in this way. Our salvation is at the center of the message. And so you have this mentioned in verse 2, we'll come back to, but so that's kind of how it breaks out. And you kind of see some themes of whether it's Jesus' divinity or his representation of God. In verse 5, he is the Son, and the Son of God. In verse 8, but to his Son, he says, "Your throne, O God." So you have divinity, deity reference to Jesus, whereas the angels are messengers. And that's going to be something we'll talk a good bit about, the distinction there and the significance of that. And then another theme that just kind of stands out to me is you have in verse 2, the purification of our sins through Jesus. And then, of course, the angels ministering to our salvation in verse 14. And so, once again, the gospel message is all about the people who it's being delivered to, which is why it's good news. And so those are just some loose framework outlines, right? So, Cody, what do you find significant, maybe for us to reflect on, or something you see?
Yeah, especially given that outline that you just gave there. The thing that I think stands out to me the most, especially in the early part of the chapter, is just how the writer is talking up Jesus as the messenger, because Jesus, he brought a message to the Jewish people, to the world in general, but specifically first to the Jewish people. But this is not the first message that they have received from God, and so you can, trying to put yourself in their shoes, you can see someone saying, "Well, why is Jesus' message better than what Moses brought, or Elijah, or any of the prophets before?" And so the Hebrews writer, like when he's first, the first thing he says to them is he has to uplift Jesus' messenger. He says, "Hey, Jesus, he is greater than any messenger that's ever come before." And he starts out with, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. And for some reason, this time reading through it, that really stood out to me, because he has to say long ago, right? Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors about things, because it's been a while since God has spoken to Israel. Before Jesus, you got that 400 years of silence. After Malachi, before Matthew. We think about it, just flip straight from Malachi to Matthew in our Bibles, but there's a lot of time in between there, after the prophets, where the people are not hearing from God. But then he says, even when he was speaking through those prophets beforehand, it came in various times and in various ways. You might obviously have some prophets like Elijah who came and said a lot of different things, but for the most part, you kind of have them kind of scattered about through the Old Testament, where there's something going on, so then God sends a prophet. It's not like an overwhelming message. So beforehand, it's been a while since God's spoken to us, and when he was speaking, it was kind of sporadic, kind of here and there. Well, the Hebrews writer says, "Hey, God is speaking to us again." That's a big deal. And he's speaking to us by his son. It's not a messenger, it's not a prophet. He's speaking through his son, and a son is elevated more than any other messenger. If we fast forward 15 years, if my son tells you something about me, well, that matters more than if my next door neighbor does, or somebody who just met me one or two times. Like there's a closeness that's there. The son is speaking for the father now, and this isn't just any son. This son was involved in the creation of everything. So, I mean, this son was around at the very beginning. He says this son is the exact representation of the Father. And so the God speaking through his son now, it's even more than just the words that he's saying. There's a sense in which you can look at the son and get the message from the Father. He is the Father. He is everything that the Father is, and everything that the Father wants us to be. You can just look at him and tell those things. And this Son, he died for sins, and of course he lived a life that allowed for that. So, in all of this, you can tell the Hebrews writers really, he's elevating Jesus. He's like, yes, I understand. People have spoken to us before, and those people were great in their own right. They were awesome, but this is different. Jesus is greater than them. He is elevated above them. And so if Jesus really is this elevated figure, you need to listen to him. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway, at least from the first couple of verses. Am I on the right track there, Nick?
Yeah, I think it flows too. I think you're exactly right, and I think it flows right through. The thing that stood out to me this time was kind of verse 8 and 9, where I was rereading this again, and he says, "But of the Son," he says, and then he quotes from the Psalms, and he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." And so while he's quoting from Psalm 45, he's referencing Jesus, "Your throne, O Son," the King, all those things we could talk about. And he says, but he's putting him in the place where the Jews would have put God the Father. When they read that psalm, when they sang that psalm, whenever they repeated or whatever they were doing to memorize and worship, that was a reference to God the Father. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. And but of the Son, he says this. And so I think Jesus being called, or referenced in the Hebrew mind, being called God by the Spirit of God, and quoting Psalm 45 is acknowledging that Jesus is one with the Father. They have one purpose. If God is approving of it, then Jesus is approving of it. If Jesus is saying it, then God is approving of it because he is in lockstep and one with the Father. And as it said earlier, as Cody mentioned, he is the exact representation. I like the way you said that because it speaks to the completeness of his knowledge of the plan and the message. Like, who else would you trust more? And I love your analogy there, like 15 years from now, or like whatever, like who are you going to know or believe? Like, my son speaks about me, that says something, whereas somebody who doesn't know me, that was great. I love that. And I think that flows really well with this thought here. So we're seeing this, and it comes up in a couple of different ways, but really in verse 8 and 9, it really stood out to me that God sent a part of himself to speak to us and to kind of pull from Philippians, right? Like Jesus was in heaven with God and he emptied himself and he came down and he dwelt among men. Jesus, to pull from John 1, Jesus was in the beginning with God and he was God. So you have this connection, and maybe we're not diving too much into how we would think about that, rather than just to say the Father who has spoken to his people is now speaking through his Son, and his Son is just like hearing from the Father. So you have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God your God has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. So there's that superiority again. So kind of to echo the beginning of the chapter, he's now spoken to us through his Son. So, Cody, you want to amplify a little bit more about Jesus as God's messenger and things that you see?
Yeah, it's just I just love the way that he weaves in those Psalms and just the Old Testament verses into it. But when we think about God speaking to us, especially through somebody, like that's always going to be a big deal, right? If the creator of the universe is speaking to you, like you got to pay attention to that. But especially if the creator of the universe is speaking to you through his son who also created the universe, right? Like that's a big deal. And I know for these first century Christians, these Jewish Christians, it may have been hard to even hear, like, oh, Jesus is God. Like that's probably a hard concept for them. But I think that's why the Hebrews writer is highlighting. He's like, yeah, I know it's kind of hard to think through this, but it's true. He is God. He is one with the Father. And if he has spoken, we really got to pay attention. And so what the writer does is he continues to take us down a list of some of the previous messengers that God spoke through, and he continues to show, hey, Jesus is elevated above all of them. He'll get to Moses, he'll get to Joshua, all those people. Just, hey, Jesus is greater. But in the latter part of this chapter, here in chapter 1, he turns his attention to the angels, and his whole point through the end of this chapter into the beginning of chapter 2 is Jesus is an elevated messenger. He is greater than the angels. And for us, maybe from the get-go it kind of feels weird, like why would he bring up angels? But angels were extremely highly thought of in Jewish culture, and I think we should be able to identify with that a bit, because we still think pretty highly of angels. If you say that somebody is an angel, guess what? You're saying a good thing about them. Whenever somebody paints an angel, they don't paint them in rags. They paint them. They're majestic. They just look amazing. Like, just like them, we still think highly of angels. And the Hebrews writer says, hey, look, if you think highly of angels, well, guess what? Jesus is above them. And even when you look at the Old Testament scriptures, like all the times where angels appear before people, they mean business, and they're actually, in some instances, they're kind of scary. I think about Balaam and the donkey, when they see the angels, like that's a big deal. And
Right.
so they think highly of them. They know that they're majestic, and at least they feel like they're above humans. And they were thought to have brought the law to Moses. So he'll get into that in Hebrews 2. Paul speaks that way in Galatians 3. Stephen in Acts chapter 7. So they recognize, okay, angels are awesome. Angels have a special place in everything that God is doing here. And so when the writer says Jesus is elevated above the angels, that matters to them. Like that's gonna pique their interest. They're gonna pay attention to that. And so I like the way that the writer brings this up, and just all the passages that he uses to illustrate that Jesus is greater than angels.
Yeah, it's so cool to see this thing and really these roles where we just see bits and pieces throughout scripture. And I think, like, speaking of angels, you're exactly right. Like, when you really read through the Old Testament and maybe like what the Hebrew mind would have associated with angel, there would have been fear, there would have been references of people like seeing a host of angels, the armies. of the Lord. You would have the messenger, like them bring, whether it's the reference in Hebrews 2, or I'm just thinking about the times where even the prophets see the throne of God, like Ezekiel, and he falls down on his face. But even the reference to Mary, who sees an angel and is afraid, like that tells us something about where currently in the first century a Jewish mind would have been when they come face to face with the glory of God that was seen through an angel, and yet Jesus is greater. And so you have angels, literally, that word just means messenger. Now we're placing Jesus as a son. Well, you have like the servant in the kingdom, and you have the heir to all things in the kingdom, right? And so you see the two differing roles, and I think that's the contrast in chapter 1 that you see so clearly. And even the different role from the disciple and the angels. They are ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. Well, now we enter into this picture already as the ones who are inheriting salvation, and the angels are ministering spirits sent out for our sake. And so, but Jesus is the Lord and the King, and we are recipients of his salvation. Angels are just the ministering spirits, the messengers, the servants in that way. And so it's drastically different when we come to the word that we're hearing. It's coming from directly from God, and we should have no doubt about that because he sent his son to give us that. So it's not to limit the glory and the greatness of angels, right? You mentioned, like, I don't think anything the Hebrew writer's doing should lessen the greatness of angels in the mind of the Hebrews, in our minds, and rather it should amplify the greatness of Jesus, the glory of Jesus, the messenger, in this case, the one through whom God sent his word. Listen to him. I was thinking about the Mount of Transfiguration in this context, right? And you think about like what Peter and James and John see, and Peter's like, let's build tabernacles to Elijah and to Moses, and God speaks directly and he says, this is my son, listen to him. And I think that's like the message to the Hebrew Christians here is the same. It's, you have all this message from God, from angels, from prophets, from, here's Jesus, listen to him. And so angels are messengers, Jesus is the son and the king. Angels are sent, and they actually worship God in the context of chapter 1. Jesus is born of God, and he is worshiped as God. Angels are ministering spirits who are sent to serve Jesus and his followers. Jesus is seated on the throne at the right hand of God, and his enemies are made a footstool to his feet. And so just a drastic contrast there in these two things to amplify why we should listen to Jesus.
Yeah, and the way I was thinking about it, like as far as wrap up kind of things go, if God speaks, we need to listen. Just period, across the board. If God's speaking, we need to listen. You add on to that, if God speaks to us through his son, we definitely need to listen. Okay, I think about that parable where the guy sends all these different servants, and they're not listening, they're killing the servants, and he's like, oh, I'll send my son, and then they'll listen, right? There's that expectation of, oh, once I send my son, that'll be a big deal, they'll pay attention, right? So if God speaks, we got to listen. If God speaks to us through his son, we need to listen. If God speaks to us through his son, who is God, we definitely need to listen, right? We better pay attention. Like you already mentioned with the Mount of Transfiguration, that's what God says. He says, this is my son, listen to him. And so we always want to take some time for honest reflection. And so I'll just ask you, are you valuing the words of Jesus? Is that something that matters to you? Does it matter to you as more than just lip service, right? Do you just say that his words matter to you, or are you living by them? Uh, I hope so, right? I hope that everybody listening is valuing Jesus's words, and if so, keep it up. I mean, I come across people all the time that, I mean, I can tell they have their noses in the word. They know the word even more than just like having stuff memorized. Like it's on their hearts. Like it informs how they live their life, and you can just tell from just walking up and talking with them. So if you're in that category, look, keep it up. I want you to stay the course. Keep doing what you're doing. But maybe you're like me, and sometimes you lose sight of just how awesome it is that God has spoken to us through his son. Well, guess what? You can make some adjustments. Can you read your Bible more? Can you study more? Can you share that word with others more? How can you show your appreciation for the privilege that it is to hear from God through his son? Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. If you liked this episode, give it a like, a share, or even a comment to let us know how we're doing. We hope we've helped you think, reflect, and be honest about your relationship with God, and we can't wait to see you again next week.